So good morning to the Caron YouTube audience. Good morning to those of you who are again with me, new and returning folks. And then good morning to those of you on closed circuit broadcast around the campus. I am returning to a topic that comes around in my rotation of topics about every 20 weeks or so. And each week when I'm embracing the topic, I think about it afresh and anew. And this particular week, as I was thinking about the topic of servanthood, I ended up in a different direction than I've ever sort of ended up before. So now that you know the direction I'm heading, you'll wonder why I would start with this. But I'm going to start with a word, fulfillment. And it's sort of opposite, I would argue, which would be emptiness. And so I don't know how fulfilled you might be feeling just this very morning. I certainly think after Wes's song, many of us are feeling, fulfilled in a certain way. And thank you very much, Wes, it was amazing. But fulfillment is a lovely thing, right? It's a precious state of being. And it's an enviable and desirable state. I think most of us would say we would like to be fulfilled. And emptiness is an undesirable state of being. And no one in this room knows emptiness at all. This particular audience is organized around the phenomenon of addiction. And so if you are somebody who's been proximal to the phenomenon of addiction, either as an addict yourself or as a family member, I think you know emptiness. And to a certain degree, and in a certain way, possibly in the most profound way. I think the epitome of emptiness is suicidality. And I think the epitome of fulfillment is what the psychologists today call flourishing. And so that's the real continuum we're talking about, is despair to flourishing. And why is this so correlated with addiction? I'm a person in long-term recovery myself. And the principal engine through which my recovery has been supported, I certainly would give credit to the God of my understanding today, but also I came to that faith that I have today out of atheism through my participation in the recovery communities that are known as 12-step communities, principally AA and NA for me. There are lots of 12-step flavors out there, and there are also lots of other options today for people who are new to recovery that may be of interest to you if you're just beginning your journey. Although the kind of aspirin of the crock versus, Tylenol and Aleve is the 12-step one. It's the foundational model. And science has affirmed that 12 steps are an evidence-based practice. There's research to show that they contribute to long-term recovery at a great rate. And there are people who struggle with the 12 steps. I don't want to get lost on that, but I'm sort of making an apology for what my principal example set today is going to be the 12 steps. It's both because I know it really well and because it speaks very well into this subject area of fulfillment and how to find fulfillment in the way I want to talk about, which is servanthood. So, what is the emptiness that I discovered I was sitting in shortly after I stopped using? I suspected if somebody had asked me if I was spiritually empty when I was drunk every day, I would have said, huh? I don't think I had tremendous insight into the state of my spiritual well-being. I might have invited you to have a shot with me or, just brushed you off. I thought all of that stuff was foo-foo, and I did identify as atheist, and I wasn't particularly preoccupied with the wellness of my soul. But suddenly, in my early recovery, I experienced the first thing I experienced is documented in the 1939 printing, the first printing of a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. And I often marvel that in 1939, when the longest sobriety among the community was about 4 years, the founder was just 4 years sober. But to me, this writing is of fantastic interest because it is, again, it's like Euclid on geometry or Socrates in philosophy. It's a founding document of a movement. And in this document, there are so many things it gets accurately that it's remarkable, and both in casting a vision forward and in talking about what recovery is like. People have complained about the document, but I find it remarkably helpful. So one of the things that I found in there, I was encouraged to read it my first week. I read it my first week. I still struggled, and then like 6 weeks later, somebody said, "Did you read the book?" I said, "Oh yeah, I read it my first week." They're like, "Yeah, you might want to read it again," because I was a little foggy in week one. And when I read it again, I was like, oh crap, here's what happened. My second reading, I was like, oh no, I've joined a voodoo religious cult. And I wanted to run away, except that it was managing to keep me sober. So then I had this dilemma. What do? Do I tolerate what I perceived as an intense religiosity, or do I flee and return to my creature comforts? So I stayed, and this experience of emptiness, its first expression was these 3 words that you find in the AA Big Book: restless, irritable, and discontented. So those of you who are here at Caron and off your taper, that's kind of where you should be. It's a very normal state for people in early abstinence, post-taper. The analog would be the baby who has his bottle taken away, right? Right? And that doesn't necessarily strike one as emptiness, but it kind of has an emptiness to it. And as I was invited to really assimilate into the 12-step community, I got a very strong message, both from the text and from the peers with whom I was in a relationship, that this spirituality thing was going to be a deal breaker, and that I really needed to find a conception of a power greater than myself, or I would have difficulty navigating this particular method. And they were very generous. They were like, hey, you can, come up with your own conception. It could be pretty much anything. It doesn't have to be a religious construction or whatever. I had a fundamental distrust of both that push and of religious institutions. So it's kind of funny that I stand here and I'm a validly ordained person. I've come a long way on this particular matter. And another thing that I heard in early recovery that speaks to the emptiness I'm talking about started to come into the foreground in this emergent period of my sobriety, which is I heard people talking in meetings about a hole in the soul. I don't know how many of you have heard that expression, but it's pretty common in recovery communities. And I didn't know if I believed in the soul, plus I had all this stay away from me stuff. But that resonated with me. I felt an emptiness. Ways it would have been expressed for me is this all there is? Because all of a sudden I didn't have the tequila hoopla, and I didn't have the weed oblivion, and I didn't have the cocaine paranoia, and I didn't have the Johnny Walker tinkling the ice cube in the glass. Sorry, I don't mean to trigger anybody too badly on something like that. I was missing those things, and they were a way, as it turned out, later I would learn that the famous co-founder, actually, of the modern psychoanalytic movement, Carl Jung, a peer to Sigmund Freud, wrote letters to the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous in the 1950s, and the year before Jung died, he had an exchange of letters with Bill Wilson. They're fascinating letters. They're part of the AA heritage. And in those letters, Carl Jung offers as a principle that human beings have a hunger, a spiritual thirst, a spiritual yearning, fundamentally. And that when people take to a religious tradition that has a God concept to it, that's a way that this fundamental yearning begins to be satisfied. I don't know that anybody ever asked Jung what he thought about the non-theistic wisdom traditions of the East, but I suspect he would have maybe used different language. But he was writing to a Westerner and writing out of his own Western formation. He quoted a Jewish writing, the Psalm, 42nd Psalm of the Hebrew tradition, which says, "As a deer pants for water, so my soul longs for you. And this is an emptiness that I think Jung is right. I think given sufficient withdrawal from the substitute forms that we adopt to try and sort of mask or feed the emptiness, I think we will discover that we have a yearning. And that there are different ways to meet this yearning, but that the fundamental meaning of it, first of all, is in connectedness. But this is where I'm headed towards my subject area, is if you look at the wisdom traditions of the world, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and if you look at psychology, what you find today is that, and through the ages, is that there's a truism, which is that we will not find the maximum flourishing and fulfillment in satisfying our own greedy desires. We will actually find the maximum fulfillment and flourishing in satisfying other people's desires. So in psychology, this principle is called Enlightened Self-Interest. So it's, in other words, unenlightened self-interest is me, and enlightened self-interest is you, right? And then if I orient myself towards your happiness, this is a weird world in which to have this conversation, by the way, because I think we see a lot in the public sphere that is not oriented towards other people's happiness, but unless you're in my particular club. But anyway, I'm going to stay with the message. So this is a fundamental testimony that you find in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Baha'i, in Judaism, in Christianity, and in psychology. Why would it be in all of these different contexts were it not to carry some extraordinary amount of weight? A beautiful quote I had from Mahatma Gandhi says, and I'm off outline, but I'll read it. He says, "The best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others." I don't know, maybe you don't believe that. I deeply believe it. So in 1989, when I found myself in these rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, I should say that in reverse order. I started in NA and then I migrated more to AA. But anyway, I found myself in these recovery rooms. They were grungy basements. I'd walk into this room and there'd be couches that didn't match and carpets that were disgusting and everything. And I think, man, this is a low rent place. And that was what I was concerned about, was like, this is not a posh club, you know, like. And if somebody had the audience to hear my inner thoughts and they would speak to it, they were like, dude, you've sort of hit that stratum, by the way, which I was not yet awake to. I still thought I was pretty like together after my third DUI and all the other embarrassments of my life, bad liver enzymes, and all that stuff. Anyway, here I was in these rooms, and early on I was coached to, this is gross, empty ashtrays. And at that time, everybody smoked. And not everybody, but smoking was accepted in an AA room. So these were church basements that looked like foggy bars. Disgusting. I haven't had a cigarette in 32 years. And yet I was accustomed to smoking, so it didn't bother me, it didn't strike me as weird. But anyway, I emptied ashtrays, I folded chairs, and I learned to be a greeter at the door. I made coffee. Those were elements that I was told early on would inculcate within me an ethic of service as a part of my recovery. Now, as a little sidebar, I will tell you, I suspected the motives for AA to advocate for service were self-preservation of the institution. I thought what they believed is that if people like us didn't stick around, that AA would wither, which to some extent might be true, right? If there's nobody left to hand it on, I didn't get it, that what they were saying is, this activity will satisfy the emptiness in your soul. It will move you incrementally out of despair and towards fulfillment. And then eventually I would graduate to the sort of principal layer of service, I think. I shouldn't say that. There are lots of layers of service in a 12-step person's life. So there's what they call 12-step work, where you go out on calls to help newcomers make it to treatment, or maybe not, when you confront people in a crisis. There's also the beautiful activity of sponsorship, where you take people through the 12 steps over a significant period of time. It's an amazing, amazing journey. It's been a huge part of my life. I still sponsor, but not in the scope or numbers that I used to. There also is this whole service layer to AA. So you can become an officer in your local group and become a secretary or a treasurer, and then you can become a representative to the layers of the organization. A significant abstraction of that. But most of us who don't know 12 steps would think, oh, that's like rising up in the ranks. Well, it turns out it's not. Like, it turns out one of the weird things about 12 steps is that it maintains this inverted structure where the authority resides at the local community and at the individual. And these are really thought of as servant roles. So if you are the area representative, you might think you're like, woo-woo, I'm a poobah of Alcoholics Anonymous, but really you're just another bozo on the bus. That's the phrase they use, that phrase exactly. And in fact, you're cautioned to be careful to still sustain a certain humility about a servant role like that. Because it's not like president or general or colonel, those kind of things. So, I'm watching time. I found a way that this speaks to me right now that I want to share about, which has to do, one of the ways my life has evolved in recent years has been to become less me career-oriented and more family-oriented, which I think is a natural evolution as a man gets gray and our life priorities change. I'm not looking for the next big job, and my next big job will be retirement whenever I can get there. I can't afford it just yet. So, a part of that is grandchildren in my life. I have 2 granddaughters. I share about them fairly frequently in this setting, so those of you who are chapel regulars are like, oh, there he goes again. But they're not my biological grandchildren. They're gifts to me through my second marriage and my wife's sons. One of her boys has these girls, Charlotte and Lila. I just adore them. We see them every week. Thank you, God. And anyway, Charlotte just started preschool this past week. And the preschool that she's going to, as it happens, my wife is a preschool teacher. So I've gotten an incredible education in early child stuff through both the girls and through Judy. And it's remarkable to me how much one can learn from being around kids. And I would argue that my wife is a ninja of human interpersonal relationships because she's a child whisperer. And so she has this incredible insight into the human condition from these beautiful young beings that she has been teaching for 25 years. We walk around the local community and this beautiful young boy comes 7 foot tall. It's like, Miss Judy! And they still remember her from her 4-year-old class. So anyway, let me get on track. Charlotte, the 4-year-old granddaughter, is going to preschool, and she's going to a school that's not where my wife teaches, but her class is organized around a book. I actually have the book, I think, here. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this book, but my wife only recently, it's called Have You Filled a Bucket Today? Anybody know the book? It's really adorable. It was published in 2005. It's in like its second edition. Caron is the author, I think. Yep. And 3 million copies, multiple languages. It's the sweetest little story. And if I was you, I'd be like, oh my God, he's going to talk children's stories. But yes, I am. Because there's wisdom in such material. And that was a disposition that I carried that I'm embarrassed about. What I've learned is I can learn from anybody. And Carol McLeod, this children's story tells children that all human beings have an invisible bucket. And that, so you have one, I have one, or sleeping young men up here have one. And I just bucket emptied by saying that. That's a mistake, right? So the hypothesis is that your bucket can be full or it can be depleted. And that a full bucket is great and a depleted bucket is less optimal. And that, interestingly, you can't really fill your own bucket. The way you fill a bucket is by filling somebody else's bucket. But you can deplete your own bucket, and the way you can deplete your own bucket is by depleting somebody else's bucket. So, when you say mean things, you're emptying somebody else's bucket and you're emptying your own. And when you do loving things, you're filling somebody else's bucket, but you're filling your own. So, and there's an interesting arithmetic to subjective things that I learned many years ago in studying philosophy. It's one of the ways you can tell whether something is from the material world or from the world of subjective, is whether math works or not. Because in marbles and money and in possessions, if I give you marbles, I have less marbles. If I give you money, I have less money, right? But if I give you love, I have more love, or at least I don't lose love I had, right? If I give you a story, it doesn't mean I have less story. So this is one of the fundamental ways that we can distinguish the subjective and immaterial, not meaning unreal, but from the material, concrete, Einsteinian world, is that math is different in the one world than the other. So, and in bucket filling, it's very much one of these worlds, where it's by sharing that I increase my own supply. And it's by diminishing that I diminish my own supply. So it's not like there isn't a math to it. It's a weird math that is fundamentally true and could be profoundly motivating. Because I do think it is the case that there are many people, I think there is such a thing as organic despair. In other words, I think that depression can come on us for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's circumstantial. The tragedies are happening in climates and storms and all sorts of bring people to down states, not of their own volition and not of their own failure to live an ethical life. But I do think also that if you practice a life of profound self-centeredness and greed, it doesn't really work. I think that's the truth. And I think if you awaken in recovery, what you'll find is that it's not that you thought, I didn't wake up in the morning when I was drinking and think I'm going to be a jerk today. But it was the myopia, it was the captivity of my addiction that caused my behavior to be perceived by others as incredibly self-centered. And in fact, then it was, right? What I did was tremendously self-centered. And I want to pass, I want an excuse, I want to say it was a disease or whatever, but that doesn't reduce the harm that came to others from my entrapment in this misery. So as I now am unshackled from the substances and behaviors that held me captive, I find myself empty, and I have this capacity. I have a yearning to fill my bucket, and I have a way to fill my bucket, which is to fill other people's bucket. And so my invitation to you is to hear that as a profound call to love one another, to love the other, rather than to preoccupy yourself with what you do or don't have as the first order of business. I think it's very tempting, especially when you're in treatment, to be like, I need to take care of me, mine, this. And there's a certain degree of self-centeredness that is appropriate in early recovery, because you gotta, if you're not alive, you're not gonna be able to make the journey. But if you want to feel better, don't attend to those things. Attend to other people, and that will help you to sort of navigate the distresses of the early part of the journey. And then hopefully you will begin to realize that this is a fundamental truth, that in the love of others we find our greatest joy. And that is today's call. Thanks, if you'll shut off the camera.